Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee. On behalf of the entire FBI, I want to begin by saying to the brave women who testified here this morning, Ms. Biles, Ms. Maroney, Ms. Nichols, and Ms. Raisman, and I gather there were some others here today who were among the many who Nassar hurt. I'm deeply and profoundly sorry to each and every one of you. I'm sorry for what you and your families have been through. I'm sorry that so many different people let you down over and over again. And I'm especially sorry that there were people at the FBI who had their own chance to stop this monster back in 2015 and failed. And that is inexcusable. It never should have happened, and we're doing everything in our power to make sure it never happens again. Now, before I became FBI director, I was generally familiar with the Nassar story shortly after his arrest in 2016, and I remember even then being appalled that there were so many people who had failed to do their jobs and keep these young women safe from that predator. But after I became FBI director, and when I learned that there were people at the FBI who had also failed these women, I was heartsick and furious. I immediately ordered a special review by our inspection division to try to get to the bottom of it. That review led in part to the Inspector General's own review, and I'm grateful to Inspector General Horowitz for his team's extensive and independent work. I want to be crystal clear. The actions and inaction of the FBI employees detailed in this report are totally unacceptable. These individuals betrayed the core duty that they have of protecting people. They failed to protect young women and girls from abuse. And the work we do certainly is often complicated and uncertain, and we're never going to be perfect. But the kinds of fundamental errors that were made in this case in 2015 and 16 should never have happened, period. And as long as I'm FBI director, I'm committed to doing everything in my power to make sure they never happen again. The FBI cannot carry out its vital mission of protecting the American people without trust. And in this case, FBI agents, certain FBI agents, broke that trust repeatedly and inexcusably. And to pretend otherwise would be yet one more insult to the survivors. Failures like the ones that happened in this case threaten the very confidence we rely on every day to keep people safe. So I want to make sure the public knows that the reprehensible conduct reflected in this report is not representative of the work that I see from our 37,000 folks every day. The actions, instead, of the agents described in this report are a discredit to all those men and women who do the job the right way with uncompromising integrity, the way the American people rightly expect and deserve. Throughout my career as a prosecutor and now at the Bureau, I have found that the agents and officers who investigate crimes against children and sex crimes are among the most compassionate and fiercely dedicated out there. And I suspect a number of you on the committee have had the same experience on your end. And I am grateful to the women who came forward today so that I can say to everyone that there is no more important work in law enforcement than helping victims of abuse. It's work that's got to get done right every single time. It is essential that we do everything we can to ensure that victims continue to come forward with confidence that their reports are going to be thoroughly and aggressively investigated. A big part of that is accountability and holding our folks to the highest standard our work requires. When I received the Inspector General's report and saw that the supervisory special agent in Indianapolis had failed to carry out even the most basic parts of the job, I immediately made sure he was no longer performing the functions of a special agent. And I can now tell you that that individual no longer works for the FBI in any capacity. As for the former Indianapolis special agent in charge, the descriptions of his behavior also reflect violations of the FBI's longstanding code of conduct and the ethical obligations for all FBI employees, especially senior officials. Now, that individual has been gone for the Bureau for about 3.5 years, having retired in January of 2018 before any review launched. And I will say it is extremely frustrating that we are left with little disciplinary recourse when people retire before their cases can be adjudicated. But let me be clear, people who engage in that kind of gross misconduct have no place in the FBI. I can also assure you that the FBI's response is not limited to dealing with those who failed so profoundly back in 2015. To make sure that something like this never happens again, we've already begun fully implementing all of the Inspector General's recommendations. That includes strengthening our policies and procedures, strengthening our training to firmly underscore the critical importance of thoroughly and expeditiously responding to all allegations of sexual assault or abuse. Because, as I said a moment ago, the American people are counting on us to get this done right every time. And finally, I'd like to make a promise to the women who appeared here today and to all survivors of abuse. I am not interested in simply addressing this wrong and moving on. It's my commitment to you that I and my entire senior leadership team are going to make damn sure everybody at the FBI remembers what happened here in heartbreaking detail. We need to remember the pain that occurred when our folks failed to do their jobs. We need to study it. We need to learn from it. That is the best way I know to make sure that this devastating tragedy is never repeated. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Inspector General Horowitz.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee. I also want to begin my testimony by recognizing the many courageous gymnasts who came forward to report Larry Nassar's abuses, and by thanking Ms. Biles, Ms. Maroney, Ms. Nichols, and Ms. Raceman for their compelling testimony today. These gymnasts have showed remarkable bravery in detailing the sexual assaults they endured. At the very same time, they were competing at the highest levels for our country. They did so with the belief that their actions would save other young women and girls from the serial abuse they endured. Sadly, as detailed in our report, the response of the FBI agents who received that information betrayed their law enforcement responsibilities and their duties to these victims. Nassar's abuses could and should have been stopped sooner if appropriate action had been taken. Not only did that not occur, but after the agents' failures came to light, records were created that inaccurately described their handling of the matter and falsely summarized the testimony, as you heard of Ms. Maroney. Further, when called to account for their actions, 2 of the agents lied to our OIG investigators. The OIG was able to investigate and identify these failures only because of the courage of the athletes who spoke to our investigators. What they did was extraordinarily difficult, and I want to thank them for their cooperation and strength in coming forward and speaking to us. Because of their actions, critical reforms are being undertaken to ensure that events such as these do not occur again. Let me briefly just summarize the results of our investigation. In July 2015, USA Gymnastics reported the sexual assault allegations against Nassar to the FBI's Indianapolis field office. USA Gymnastics officials described graphic information that had been provided by Ms. Maroney, Ms. Nichols, and Ms. Raceman, and informed the FBI that all 3 athletes were available to be interviewed. However, it wasn't until 6 weeks later, on September 2nd, that the Indianapolis office interviewed Ms. Maroney by telephone, as you heard, and neither Ms. Nichols nor Ms. Raceman were ever interviewed by that office. Moreover, the Indianapolis office did not formally document its interview of Ms. Maroney at the time or its July meeting with USA Gymnastics. The office also didn't formally open an investigation or an assessment of the matter. Immediately following that September 2nd interview, the Indianapolis office and local federal prosecutors concluded there was no venue in Indianapolis for the federal investigation. Both offices also had serious questions as to whether there was federal criminal jurisdiction as opposed to state or local jurisdiction. Yet, the Indianapolis field office didn't advise state or local authorities about the allegations and didn't take any actions to mitigate the risks to gymnasts that Nassar was continuing to treat. Further, that office failed to transfer the case to the FBI office that actually might have had venue, despite informing USA Gymnastics that it had actually done so. After 8 months of FBI inactivity, in May 2016, USA Gymnastics officials contacted the FBI's Los Angeles field office to report the same allegations it had provided to the Indianapolis office. Following this meeting, the LA office opened a federal investigation and undertook numerous investigative steps. But critically, it didn't contact state or local authorities, and it didn't take action to mitigate the ongoing threat presented by Nassar. It wasn't until August 2016 when Michigan State University Police, that police department, received a separate sexual assault complaint from another gymnast. And in September 2016, the next month, the MSU Police Department executed a court-authorized search of Nassar's residence. Among other things, they seized devices containing over 30,000 images of child pornography. According to civil court documents, approximately 70 or more young athletes were allegedly sexually abused by Nassar under the guise of medical treatment between July 2015, when the FBI first received these allegations, until September 2016. We further found that when the FBI's handling of the Nassar matter came under scrutiny in 2017 and 2018, Indianapolis officials provided inaccurate information to make it appear that they had actually been diligent in their follow-up efforts and did so in part by blaming others. In addition, it resulted in the Indianapolis Supervisory Special Agent drafting a summary of his telephonic interview of Ms. Maroney from 2015. That summary included statements, as you heard from Ms. Maroney, that didn't accurately reflect what she had told them and could have actually jeopardized the criminal investigations by including false information that could have bolstered Nassar's defense. Further, we concluded that agent made false testimony statements to the OIG in 2 interviews that we conducted. We also learned during our investigation that in the fall of 2015, the FBI Indianapolis Special Agent in Charge, Jay Abbott, met with USA Gymnastics President Steve Penny at a bar and discussed a potential job opportunity with the US Olympic Committee. Thereafter, Abbott engaged with Penny about both his interest in the US Olympic Committee job and the Nassar investigation, while at the same time participating in Nassar investigation discussions at the FBI. Abbott applied for the US Olympic Committee position in 2017, but wasn't selected. We determined that Abbott's actions violated the FBI's clear conflicts of interest policy. We also found that Abbott made false statements to the OIG and my agents in 2 interviews that we conducted. I want to conclude my testimony where I started by recognizing the courage and bravery of the extraordinary gymnasts that we heard from today and that we've heard from and that came before law enforcement in other settings. Their persistence and strength are an example to all of us who work in the area of accountability and who want to promote accountability. Although the sexual abuses by Nassar and the appallingly inadequate response by the FBI agents cannot be undone, these athletes' commitment to justice and their pursuit of accountability for all involved in this deeply tragic series of events will improve our institutions ultimately and will help ensure federal law enforcement responds in an appropriate and a timely way to reports of sexual abuse in the future. Our report recommends several important and necessary reforms. As Director Wray indicated, the FBI has begun taking them, and we will continue to conduct our independent oversight work to ensure that they're effectively implemented. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you very much, Inspector General Horowitz, and thank you for your excellent work, as usual, in this report. Director Wray, I'm trying, it had to touch you personally, not only in your official capacity, but even just as a parent, to listen to these young women tell the stories of what they had been through. And what strikes me here is there doesn't seem to have ever been a sense of urgency or immediacy in that Indianapolis field office. The July reporting leading to the September vain attempt to change venue on the case to Lansing, which didn't happen, and then the later report in Los Angeles, and then they sat on it. What's missing? What am I missing here? This is like a child kidnapping case. This man is on the loose molesting children, and it appears that it's being lost in the paperwork of the agency.
Well, needless to say, I share your reactions. I share your bewilderment. I share your outrage. On a personal note, not just as a parent or a brother or a husband, but as somebody whose first introduction to law enforcement was working as an intern in a DA's office in a unit specifically focused on these kinds of crimes, was part of what motivated me to pursue a career in law enforcement in the first place. And I don't have a good explanation for you. It is utterly jarring to me. It is totally inconsistent with what we train our people on, totally inconsistent with what I see from the hundreds of agents who work these cases every day. And that's why that individual has been fired.
Understood. But you also heard Ms. Maroney talk about, I can't imagine this. 3 hours she's sitting on her bedroom floor going through an interview, which you could tell was by a person, whoever it was, totally insensitive to this young woman's tragic experience. What has the FBI learned from that? I mean, in terms of cases of this sensitivity, to at least have interviewers that can sense there are certain words you better be careful with.
Well, thank you for that question. It illustrates something that's particularly important that we've put in place. So we have something called CAFEs, which are child adolescent forensic interviews. These are interviewers who are specially trained in the unique sensitivities of what it takes to interview people, of victims, survivors of these kinds of crimes. And one of the reforms that we've put in place is to make crystal clear in policy that interviews of individuals like Ms. Raisman should be conducted with those kinds of interviewers. And they should not be conducted telephonically. They should be conducted in person wherever possible. That was true before. We've made it more clear now, and we're putting training in place, mandatory training, which has already been completed to ensure that that occurs. So that's partial answer to your question on that one.
General Horowitz, did any of the FBI employees or agents involved in this case deliberately misrepresent any facts to you in your investigation?
They did. We found both that the person who wrote the report that Ms. Maroney testified about falsely testified to us about what he did in connection with that report, as well as other matters that we asked him about, and Special Agent in Charge Abbott made false statements to us about the steps he took in 2015 when these allegations came in, but also about his job-seeking efforts with the US Olympic Committee.
Did these deliberate misrepresentations reach the level of criminal violation?
Well, we found that they violated criminal law sufficiently that what we do at that point is make the referral to prosecutors to assess them, because that's who needs to make the decision whether or not there will be charges brought.
Director Wray, what happened next?
Well, as Inspector General Horowitz said, those were referred to the prosecutors over at the Justice Department, and they're the ones that made the decision. As I understand it from Inspector General Horowitz's report, the prosecutors at the Justice Department on two separate occasions, both in 2020 and then again in 2021, declined to prosecute, but I really would defer to the Justice Department for those
Are you
decisions.
personally aware or professionally aware of any facts or circumstances that would lead to that decision?
I am not.
Well, it is outrageous, and I am sorry, because I have a great faith in this Attorney General and his Department of Justice, but when we asked them to bring someone in to explain this today, they refused and said they wouldn't attend. And I understand that it's procedure in the department not to go into the basis for deciding that not to pursue prosecution, but this is on its face obvious that these agents not only were derelict in their duty when it came to these young women, but also did their best to cover up what had happened, and that is inexcusable from where I'm standing. So let me ask you this finally, Director Wray. I'm going to accept your profession of real caring, and I believe it is real caring about what happened in this circumstance today. What can you tell me if it happened tomorrow would be different?
So there's a whole bunch of things we've done differently. First, we've accepted every single one of Inspector General Horowitz's recommendation and then some. We've already begun implementing all of those. We are strengthening policies, we're strengthening procedures, we're strengthening training, we're strengthening our systems, all building in double checks, triple checks, safeguards, oversight, different ways of making sure that we cannot have, as occurred here in certain instances, a single point of failure. That's one of the lessons here. That's just totally unacceptable. And so part of what's built in is a bunch of, as I said, double and triple, even quadruple checks to make sure that that doesn't happen, both in terms of how the initial reports are handled, the appropriate urgency there, but also in terms of communication. One of the important recommendations from Inspector General Horowitz is reporting to state and local law enforcement, as well as communications between field offices, transfers between field offices. And I can go into more detail about any of those, but those are part of it. And then the last thing I would say is that there are some things that occurred here that are just so basic and so fundamental and so foreclosed by our policies. As Inspector General Horowitz said, we have pretty clear policies on a lot of these things. And so I have tried to make clear in very stern language to not just the field offices involved here, but to the executive management of every single field office and the entire leadership team of the FBI, that on no planet is what happened in this case acceptable.
One last quick question. It seems that a lot of the decisions were being pinned on whether or not there was an alleged violation of the sex tourism statute. Why is that such an exclusive remedy that if you're not on all fours with that, in fact, the FBI agent felt that they were constrained to do anything? Well,
I'm not steeped in the particulars of the sex tourism statute in the way that I used to be, but what I would say is that one of the things that we've tried, both the deputy director and I, to make clear to people is that we don't want people getting wrapped around the axle about federal jurisdiction issues at the front end. Part of what needs to happen while they're figuring that out in consultation with the prosecutors, which is what should happen, they need to make sure that they're reporting to state and local law enforcement on a parallel track. And so that's one of the key takeaways that comes out of Inspector General Horowitz's report.
Thank you. Senator Grassley.
Yeah, please give me a minute before the clock starts to ask unanimous consent to include in the record letters that I have sent over the last few years that show the non-responsiveness of the FBI to our inquiries on this subject.
Without objection.
And then a second one would be a little bit unrelated to this, but it deals with the unresponsiveness of Director Wray in regard to, so I hope the committee will listen to this as well. I've asked Director Wray several times to meet with me relating to a very troubling briefing that I received August 2020 from the FBI, and which was later weaponized against my and Senator Johnson's oversight. Director Wray and his staff have ignored my request to meet, mimicking the pattern here at the Nassar case non-responsiveness. So without objection, I'd like to introduce into the record of the hearing today an email thread illustrating the FBI's non-responsiveness to my request. This email shows the great length that I went to getting a meeting with Director Wray. Okay. Now my question to Director Wray, the Inspector General's report shows that J. Abbott, a senior official in the Indianapolis field office at FBI, was allowed to retire in 2018 and evade prosecution, even though this report describes significant misconduct by him and an agent under his supervision. I've asked that the Attorney General reconsider the decision not to file charges against some of the individuals involved in the case, and I'd like you to provide this committee with a list of all disciplinary actions that took place with respect to FBI personnel who were the subject of this investigation. I believe that you owe that, at the very least, to the victims of today's hearing.
Well, we can provide the committee with whatever information we can. Certainly, as I've already testified here today, the special agent, the supervisory special agent who features so prominently in Inspector General Horowitz's report, I can confirm has been terminated. As to the former special agent in charge, he retired before this review commenced, before we learned the extent of his misconduct, much to my frustration. And as to the decision whether or not to prosecute either individual, I would respectfully refer over to the Justice Department, which I think is where, Senator Grassley, you said your letter was appropriately directed.
I'd like you to cooperate in ensuring that the prosecution of those individuals who failed these victims, and give us your commitment that you would go to the Justice Department again to try to get that done.
Well, I'm happy to do whatever would be appropriate. In this particular case, the criminal investigation that was conducted, the case agents, as it were from Inspector General Horowitz's office, which I think is as appropriate. So that's really a discussion between his office and the Justice Department. But if I can be a constructive part of that, given how strongly I feel, as I hope the committee can tell, I'm happy to do whatever I can that would be appropriate.
Next question. Why didn't the Children's Unit at headquarters play a greater supervisory or coordination role here? For example, by ensuring that the correct office at FBI handled this matter? And why didn't it follow up to ensure that the Indianapolis office had referred the matter to an FBI office that had jurisdiction over these allegations?
Well, I want to be careful not to try to paraphrase too much Inspector General Horowitz's report, since he's really the master of the facts here. But as I understand it, among the things that happened here were that the Indianapolis folks most responsible concealed information from certain people at headquarters at different stages of, that's part of the problem. We have implemented changes now that go to the point that you're getting at, which is the transfers between field offices. We've built in a number of additional checks, and one of those 3 or 4 additional checks that we've built in now gives headquarters program management visibility, so that which they're to monitor, so that they can ensure, as a second, third, fourth check, if you will, to make sure that the work is being followed up on and that the transfer is appropriately handled.
Did anyone at the FBI headquarters consult with Indianapolis and Los Angeles offices about notifying state and local authorities about the allegations against Nassar?
I don't know the answer to that, but Inspector General Horowitz did the investigation, so I'll let him speak to the facts.
Senator, I'm not aware of discussions about referring it to state and local authorities.
Director Wray, how far did knowledge of the Nassar investigation extend within FBI headquarters in 2015?
My understanding of the most senior individual involved, based on looking at the thorough and independent investigation that Inspector General Horowitz conducted, was that the most senior individual with sort of knowledge and responsibility was the special agent in charge in Indianapolis, Mr. Abbott. But again, I would defer to Inspector General Horowitz on that.
Was the director aware of the Nassar matter at any time in or before calendar year 2016?
I don't know the answer to that, sir, but maybe Inspector General Horowitz does.
Prior to 2017, did the FBI headquarters follow up with its field offices about the status of the Nassar investigation and whether further federal investigation was needed?
Senator, there was in 2016 some dialogue about that, but as we describe in our report, the FBI policies don't require the level of detail and reporting to the headquarters unit that would, for example, put the responsibility directly on them to have notified state and local authorities.
Senator Leahy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad, Mr. Horowitz and Director Wray, that you're here, but the conclusions we have here are, I suppose a nice way you could say is they're troubling. They're damning. They're horrible. And I think of the young women who testified here today, what they went through, and I don't see where they get much solace out of listening to this. And what do the American people feel? Senator Grassley just mentioned, Mr. Howard said about Jay Abbott, named in the IG report. He retired. Was that a forced retirement?
It was not.
Did he ever face any possibility of prosecution?
We referred our findings to the department's prosecutors for consideration about the false statements that he made to us in our interviews.
By consideration, do you make a recommendation when you do that?
We don't make a formal recommendation. As you know, as a former prosecutor, and I was a former prosecutor, there are informal discussions, but ultimately the responsibility for the decision is with the prosecutors. And I will say, having written a report a couple of years ago about the prior FBI director's statements at a public press conference about what he would do if he were the prosecutor, I'm not about to jump in and take someone else's responsibility.
No, I understand that. And when I was a prosecutor, law enforcement sent their investigations. I had to make the final decision, of course. But I think of the number of people who get charged for lying to FBI agents. I mean, we've seen such charges brought in various areas, everything from organized crime on. It is troubling to me to see that an FBI agent who lied, broke the law, knew he was breaking the law, and nothing happens. I understand the procedures, but it bothers me greatly. The failures by the FBI field office in Indianapolis delayed the starting investigation of Larry Nassar's widespread sexual assaults of over 100 victims. And everybody, I don't care where they are on the political spectrum or anything else, had to be torn apart listening to the testimony of these victims this morning. I know I was. And we talked about Ms. Raisman's testimony. She didn't have a parent or lawyer present when she was being questioned. Director Wray, is that, you've mentioned changes in procedures. I realize this happened before you were director, and I'm asking the changes in procedure. Today, would she have a parent or lawyer present with her?
Well, that would be a discussion between the agents and her parents. One of the things that, as I said, that we've changed is to step up the emphasis on these, what we call CAFIs, C-A-F-I, these child adolescent forensic interviewers. And I cannot stress enough how important it is to view these kinds of interviews as a very unique kind of interview. There's all sorts of sensitivities, and we heard a lot about it in a very powerful way from the women who testified here this morning. and the point you made about parents, et cetera, that's part of one of those many sensitivities. And so that's why it's so important to have interviews done by, or at least heavily involving, these child adolescent forensic interviewers. That's why we have that program. That's why the policy's been strengthened to increase the use of them and to require them. That's why we've discouraged, as much as possible, telephonic interviews at all in these kinds of cases. And one of the other, I think, helpful points that came out of Inspector General Horowitz's report is the clarification that should also take into account women who are adults at the time of the interview, but who were victimized when they were minors, and because that is its own kind of unique sensitivity. So we're trying very hard to push out that program to avoid the kind of really heartbreaking insensitivity that you just alluded to.
Well, the supervisory special agent in Indianapolis, Michael Angelman, has now been fired. Have there been recommendations? What took so long to fire him, I might ask?
Well, we waited for the report. One of the things that I want to make sure is that we don't have a situation where two wrongs make a right. And so we waited until we had the Inspector General's independent report. We followed our disciplinary process, and he's been fired.
Did he contest the firing?
I probably can't get into that discussion here. I want to be sensitive about Privacy Act concerns and so forth.
Mr. Horowitz, if you can say, has there been a recommendation that he be prosecuted?
Again, what happened in these discussions generally or interactions with the prosecutors, generally speaking, we don't make a formal recommendation to the prosecutors, and I think you'd have to have the department's officials speak to that issue.
Okay, well, I'll just close with this. I mean, I look at a whole lot of people who should be prosecuted here. Besides, Nassar obviously should be prosecuted, but I'm thinking of some of the people within the athletic field that were aware of this, who turned a blind eye to it, who did nothing to it, and allowed all these victims to be there. I'm not talking about people in government, but even people outside. There are a whole lot of people who should be in prison. I'm glad he's in prison. But I got to tell you, frankly, as a parent, as a grandparent, there's a hell of a lot more I'd like to see in prison. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, when this report was released, and that's the IG report, on July 14, the FBI publicly promised, quote, to take all necessary steps to ensure that the failure of the employees outlined in the report do not happen again.
No,
That's a direct quote and an important promise. Can you please describe the specific steps the FBI has taken in the past 2 months to ensure that these failures do not happen again?
Thank you, Senator Feinstein, for the question. So first, as has already been mentioned, the disciplinary process has already been completed on the supervisory special agent, and he's been fired. Second, we have strengthened policies, procedures, systems, and training to address and incorporate underline all of Inspector General Horowitz's recommendations. Many of them are already complete now. So that includes, for example, on the issue of reporting to state and local law enforcement, which, by the way, should have happened here anyways, but to assure that it happens going forward, we now require that the agent handling one of these cases has to document that he's reported it, so there's an audit trail and he's accountable that way, that he has to confirm it to his supervisor, and we've had additional mandatory training for everyone involved. We've had 2 kinds of training already implemented. One for every single employee in the FBI, and I've taken that training myself, but also training specifically targeted at the employees who handle these kinds of cases and their supervisors. So that's just on that one piece, but we have similar changes to the transfers between field offices and so forth.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes?
I don't want to go into more specifics. I heard his commitment. I would like to see it in writing sent to this committee in the form of a letter following this hearing, so that we have written evidence that the FBI is going to do certain things.
I can certainly join you in preparing a letter to the FBI, which they can respond to and with specifics in the director's signature, correct?
Yes, sir.
I very much would appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Mr. Horowitz, I am concerned that the FBI's failures in this case may be a symptom of a broader failure to treat cases of child sexual abuse with the seriousness and sensitivity that they deserve. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys experience child sexual abuse during their childhood. Our law enforcement agencies really should ensure our children are protected. Have you seen other instances in which the FBI's failure to properly investigate a case led to ongoing sexual misconduct or harm to children that could have been prevented?
Senator, thank you. I agree with you about the significance, importance of this. We didn't do a broader look at this, but I will say, speaking to your point, what concerned me particularly here, even though we didn't do a broad look at other cases, was we actually had 2 offices who dealt with this matter, the Indianapolis office and the LA office. The Indianapolis office had all of the basic fundamental failures that you've heard about and we've talked about, and didn't tell state and local law enforcement. The LA field office actually did open a case, an investigation, actually did interview witnesses, did do follow-up with some of the gymnasts, and yet they also failed to report to state and local authorities. So you had an office that actually took this seriously, but didn't do what was also, I think, fair to say, a fundamental step, particularly since they also had concerns about whether there was federal law enforcement, federal jurisdiction here, because as we all know, these are usually the province of state and local prosecutors and investigators. And again, going back to something Director Wray said, the FBI policies before this made it clear that in these kind of cases, state and local prosecutors are, investigators are force multipliers. And yet it didn't occur in either office. And that was particularly concerning.
Well, let me just for a moment engage you on that. You said a number of things in your statement. It is really important. Can this be put in any form of policy which becomes operational procedure for the agency, so that this committee and others know that things are going to change based on what has happened in the recent past?
And the report makes clear, and what we've heard today makes clear, and Senator Blumenthal and Senator Moran's report make
Absolutely,
clear,
but what
things
I'm
have to
talking
change.
about are your procedures,
right.
not what we say.
No, right. And what has to happen is what Director Wray mentioned that they are doing already, and what we all need to do, the FBI, the OIG, this committee, is do the follow-up you're talking about. We are going to continue to do our independent oversight of how those recommendations have been implemented, like we do in all our reports. We will follow up with that. I am happy to report back to the committee on what we've seen, but steps do have to be taken, because there does have to be, and it sounds like the FBI has taken those steps, to ensure record keeping on the fact that something did occur. And that may sound obvious, and I know it could sound trivial at times, but one of the damning findings here is the lack of record keeping that was occurring in 2015 that was only documented or attempted to be documented in 2017 and then done falsely.
Could I don't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah.
But I would really, after all of the emotion and all of what we now know, 5 years later, to see new practices go into place, And what I'm asking both of you is to do that and give us here and now some statement of your intent to do that, and that they will be posted and people will be trained in them and that they will be held responsible to carry them out, so that what we've said here and spent the time here can really make the change that's necessary. That no small child is going to be questioned by an FBI agent on the phone, you know, about this kind of thing. But what your practices are, so that everybody knows.
We always follow up on our recommendations. We will do that here. You have my commitment. We will report back to you what we found, and it will be up to the FBI to implement them, but we will not stop reviewing this matter until we're confident, we, the OIG, me, are confident that the steps were taken that needed to be taken.
And I would just add that that's exactly what's contemplated with the incorporation of all of Inspector General Horowitz's recommendation, policy changes, additional safeguards in the process, mandatory training that addresses this. I can put all that in the letter that you and the chairman discussed. I would add that.
To the chairman and to the committee, would you put that in a letter?
Yeah, we'll walk through the things that we're
Thank
doing
you.
in
Thank you,
response to.
Senator Feinstein.
And can I just add, Mr. Chairman, as you know, and I think Senator Feinstein, as you know, I'm available at any time to meet with you, to discuss this with you further, informally, more formally, and you have my commitment to that.
Thank you.
May I just add, Mr. Chairman, just in response to something else that Senator Feinstein, you asked, I would be remiss if I didn't make the point that the work that I saw in this case that's reflected in what Inspector General Horowitz found, part of what was so head-jerking to me is how inconsistent it is with what I see from the agents, analysts, and professional staff who work these cases every day. And I've seen them as a prosecutor, I've seen them now as FBI director, and over the last 5 years, our folks working with their partners have made 16,000 arrests of people like Mr. Nassar. And that by itself should be deeply, that should be deeply troubling and encouraging at the same time. Encouraging in the sense that there's those people taken off the streets, but deeply disturbing because it gives you a sense of just the sheer scale of this kind of abuse in this country. Because I have no doubt that for the 16,000 arrests that we made, Lord knows how many other predators there are out there that we didn't get.
Yes, that's staggering to me.
It is.
I think we need to follow
We have
up.
to.
Thank you very
We
much.
have members who are,
Thank you.
have plain schedules, and we want to make sure they have their chance. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin. Director Wray, it strikes me very strongly as we sit here today and as we heard the powerful testimony earlier this morning, that the last time a woman came forward in this committee to testify to her allegations of sexual assault in her childhood, the witness was Christine Blasey Ford. It appeared to me then, and it appears to me now, that her testimony was swept under the rug in a confirmation stampede. It is very possible that the FBI investigation of her allegations was just as flawed, just as constrained, just as inappropriate as the investigation in this case. We don't know because we don't have answers. I am still trying to get answers from you and from your organization, along with Senator Coons and others, after more than 2 years. Our first letter requesting information was in August 1st of 2019. Our follow-up, we got a response to yesterday, 2 months afterwards. Not coincidentally, I suspect on the eve of your appearance today. Somebody said, oh, we better get something up there because we haven't answered this question. In that letter dated yesterday, the assistant director said that the FBI is working with the department to identify and make available certain relevant documents. So the answer wasn't even an answer, it was an answer that at some date in the future, we might actually get an answer. Today, now, can you give me that date when these certain relevant documents will be provided to us?
So I am aware both of your prior letter, but also of the letter that you most recently sent that I saw on Monday. And
Get to that in a minute. Let's start with the one I...
Right. So the documents that, as I understand, are referenced in the letter that we sent yesterday, we are working with the department, and we expect to get you those within the next 2 weeks.
Very well. I'll be interested to see what deliberative executive branch information is included, as it strikes me that our request doesn't get into deliberative process at all. But we'll see how that goes. I just hope that that's not being put up as yet another stall, delay, interference, obstruction to us getting the answers in the documents that we need. So separately, you went to it. I told you that if when I next had the chance, and today looked like it might be it, I wanted to ask you some very specific questions, and I didn't want to catch you by surprise. I wanted to let you know what those questions would be. So I sent on September 10th the letter with questions that, again, relate to Dr. Blasey Ford's allegations. I have 51 seconds left, so it's not going to work now. What I would like you to do is to tell me the date here and now when you will give me answers to these questions treated as a QFR. Just answer them in writing. As you know, I went years without getting QFRs answered by you and the FBI, and I'd like to get a date now in the plain view of the committee with everybody listening when these QFRs will be answered, when these questions will be answered as a QFR. Question for the record.
So I understand your request. My goal would be to try to have as many as possible of the details in response to your question included in the response that we're looking to get you within the next 2 weeks.
Please
I say that because, like I said, I read your letter on Monday. We're already working on it, and we will endeavor to get, I think a lot of what we will be providing within the next 2 weeks will be responsive to those questions. But I need to study them more. Today, I've really been focused, as I know you are, on the Nassar case, what happened to these women, and in particular, the FBI's botched handling of this particular case in 2015.
Yeah, let's just make sure that there wasn't also a botched handling of another allegation in this committee with regard to Dr. Ford. Thank you.
Senator Coons?
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and thank you, Senator Whitehouse, for your persistent engagement on the question of whether or not the tip line in the investigation to the allegations of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford was appropriately handled or not. I continue to join you in asking for some follow-up on our letters of the last few years. Mr. Horowitz, if I might, I think this is an almost textbook demonstration of the positive role that an inspector general can play. And broadly speaking, Director Wray, I appreciate your responses as the director to the testimony and to the recommendations. But I do want to make sure that we've covered a couple of things. Just many of my colleagues have already covered topics that I wanted to, but one of the talented athletes and survivors who testified to us today was very pointed, Ms. Allie Raceman, in saying that she believes there hasn't been a thorough, factual, independent investigation. And I know Senator Blumenthal, who's an extremely capable senator and attorney and is quite experienced in investigations. He might speak to that. He and Senator Moran have conducted one. But my impression from what she'd said and what I've read is that their concern is that USA Gymnastics and the Olympic Committee have thrown a variety of roadblocks into a genuinely thorough investigation into whether there had or hadn't been previous incidents similar to Dr. Nassar, either in USA Gymnastics or within sports more broadly. It is hard to believe that this is the only time that there's been a failing of this scale, given Director Wray, what you just said about the 16,000 arrests. We all know that the horror of child sexual abuse is tragically far more widespread in this country and around the world than any of us would like to see. So first, Mr. Horowitz, do you think there is still a pressing need, and who would be the appropriate entity to conduct that? And what, if any, advice do you have for us on respecting her request to this committee?
It's a great question, Senator Coons. And frankly, as you indicated, the reason we couldn't do a report like this and other reports that we've been able to do is because of the statutory authorities that we've been given by the Congress that make us independent. And by the way, picking up on something Ms. Raceman said, which was very perceptive, about who's funding the oversight. As you know, back in 2008, we were given an independent budget line so that our budget is not coming from the Justice Department, but is being set by an independent appropriator. I don't know, as I sit here, frankly, what the oversight mechanisms are currently on USOC and the other entities. But actually, one of the things I did have a chance to talk with Senator Blumenthal about during the break was the importance of, given what I'd heard from these gymnasts, the very issue you just mentioned, which is thinking about what is the right independent oversight mechanism of those bodies, which are not just private entities, right? These are organizations that have been sanctioned by Congress to oversee our U.S. athletes, and they need strong oversight as well. And I'm happy to work with you as well, Senator, and the committee in thinking about how to do that, because we are seeing the IG model replicated in many places, as you know, across the country, including many state and local entities.
I also, frankly, in the opportunities I've had to visit with legislatures and national assemblies in other countries, the absence of a comparable structure is often at the core of how government entities fail to be held accountable. Exactly. And do I understand correctly, it's your testimony to us today, that the FBI director and the FBI broadly has embraced and is implementing the 4 major policy recommendations you made? That's
correct. Director Wray made that clear before he actually got the report, as he was telling us, he was waiting for this report and could take those actions, and he has certainly indicated to us, and we've gotten some information about the steps that have been taken. But, as he knows, and as you all know, we will independently look at that. It won't just be the FBI's word for it. You will also have OIG oversight of it.
Last question for both of you, if I might. As you've gone back and reviewed this case, was there anything specific to the culture, the training, the promotion, the supervision, anything about the culture of these 2 specific field offices, Indianapolis in particular, that you think led to this shocking and uncharacteristic failure to follow even the most basic ethical and policy and procedural guidelines by the special agent in charge in this case?
I didn't, my agents, pick up anything specific to the 2 offices as a cultural issue there. I will say, again, going back to the point that I mentioned with Senator Feinstein, what concerned me looking at this as a former prosecutor is the reluctance or the failure, because I'm not sure they really thought about it, of both these offices, one that did nothing, one that did something, to actually engage with their state and local partners. Yeah. And that is a mindset that needs to be changed. I know Director Wray believes that as well, but to see that in 2 offices, one of whom did actually do something, clearly followed up, was concerning.
Well, I look forward to working to reauthorize the Victims of the Child Abuse Act and to work with you to ensure that federal and state and local law enforcement coordinates as effectively as possible, and that interviews of victims are conducted in a professional and appropriate and a supportive way. Thank you for your testimony.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.